Hello. Good afternoon, you guys. So, I already recorded this video before, but I thought I'd give it a second try. I had therapy today, and I just got done with therapy, so I'm feeling a little bit more loose. So maybe that might help me talk about it in a much more comfortable and concise way. I guess this is going to be maybe my fourth video diary slash vlog or whatever. Um, I'm not exactly sure what I want to say. If you haven't noticed, I tend to have very, very long videos and I struggle to get out my thoughts. Um, as you know, I'm someone who struggles with PTSD and you know, I struggle with a lot. So it's just very hard for me to, you know, find my voice. It especially can take me some time because I'm very choosy with my words. Um, because I find that sometimes using the right word is much better than using a lot of the wrong words, right? Using a lot of weak words is sometimes ineffective, not as effective as using the right word, right? So it just makes it hard. But I do have something, kind of a vague idea of what I want to talk about today. Um, and hopefully you can follow along with me to try to understand what it is I'm touching on or what it is I'm trying to talk about. Um, so I'm going to start off just by telling a short story about how this particular thought came along. You know, my last video, I generally knew exactly what I wanted to say, and so it kind of came out much more fluidly, um, felt much more naturally. But here goes. A couple videos ago, I received a comment on one of my videos that bugged me. It bothered me so much that I literally deleted the comment. Just because I didn't want to deal with it. Basically, my video was about my difficulty dealing with the healthcare system and the fact that I'm on a really long wait list, despite being in a state that supposedly has very progressive healthcare policies. Has to do with the fact that um, that I'm dealing with a condition. I'm dealing with a condition that has been very debilitating for me, and um, yeah, I'm not necessarily just about the. I'm dealing with a condition that has been very debilitating for me, and how difficult it has been to navigate that condition and manage my symptoms of that condition, while also maintain some degree of normalcy in my life, and also to perform adequately to keep my head above water, right? Because we have to perform adequately in society to get along. And so I've been dealing um, with I've been basically fighting two battles, and I've been doing this balancing act between the two, and that I've been on this wait list For 2 years, I've already waited from start to now. It's been 2 years since I got the referral from my physician. Um, you know, for very necessary medical treatment, and how the wait list to actually get access to it is going to be another year. So from start to finish, it would be 3 years. And I was expressing the difficulty that I've had dealing with all these things in my life, and basically trying to manage every single one and make sure that they all go off without a hitch. And someone in my video basically commented something that really frustrated me, because I'm very stressed. And when you're dealing with stress, sometimes it makes your fuse a lot shorter. They basically told me, have you heard of the healthcare system? If you live in California, you can get Medi-Cal and it covers it, and then you don't have to worry about it. Because I was thinking of getting it paid for out of pocket in order to receive it faster, because the condition is so debilitating, it's quite ridiculous. And it frustrated me because it was kind of like, okay, well, I'm pretty sure I mentioned that I did live in California in the video. So first of all, it feels disrespectful that they didn't listen to me. But I'm not exactly sure if I had mentioned that or not. Maybe it wasn't quite clear. And I also talked a lot about poverty and the fact that I've been homeless so much, and that I've just moved from place to place, basically fleeing domestic violence, sexual assault, hostility, unsafe work conditions, unsafe living environments, and a volatile local community that does not seem to provide me with the support and fill the gaps in my life with much needed support, right? I've been unable to fill these gaps. I explained a lot of that in the video. I talked a lot about it, but this person was like, you can get Medi-Cal, and then it's free. The state covers it. And the thing is, though, is that when this person made this comment, they were being very well-meaning. They were being quite well-meaning. They were not insulting me. They were not disrespecting me, yet it made me angry. Why? Why do some things, and so that's what I'm going to talk about more, is why some things make us angry. Even when they shouldn't necessarily, or they weren't intended to make us angry. The reason that it made me angry was because if I'm gasping for breath, right? If I'm expending all this energy and this time telling you about my troubles and my struggles, and I'm coming to you talking about it on a YouTube video, surely I already looked into those things, right? Those, government assistance would be the first thing that anybody goes to, right? Or government programs. So surely if I'm making a YouTube video, I've already done that, right? If I'm coming to you for help, or I'm coming to you just to vent, then surely I've already looked into it. So it felt like it kind of insulted my intelligence, because it seems so obvious. But the problem is that I'm not allowed to get angry about it, because they were so well-meaning. At least that's how I feel. I feel as though quite often that I'm angry about things, but I'm not allowed to get mad at them. And it made me think about something else. Let me try to remember what it made me think about. Um, Sorry. It made me think about it made me think about defensiveness and human conflict. It made me think about aggression, and it made me think about anger. I'm going to give you another short story. Okay. It made me think about ego, entitlement, and boundaries. And it made me think about social cohesion. It made me think about community and relationships and understanding and common sense, things like common sense and stuff. Let me give you another short story example. So there is a YouTuber. Um, um, her handle is Punk Ruck, and she uploaded a video of her pole dancing, and she was doing a really good job. She looked quite, attractive doing it. She seemed to be a very good dancer. And I posted a comment expressing the fact that I have trouble understanding sometimes people's motives behind things. And, I've seen this happen a lot. And it seems to be a common human behavior is, adult dancing and people dancing in a very adult way. And me personally, I've always struggled to understand it because I have a hard time. Now, first of all, I've never danced very much. I used to dance when I was little, but I've never been much of a dancer. But I definitely can say that I've never really been much of an adult dancer. And so it just kind of confuses me sometimes when I look at this behavior of people doing very adult dancing, concepts like twerking. Um, I'm not blind. I'm not stupid. I'm not a lizard. I can see that it's very arousing, right? I can see that much. But I don't understand why, like why someone does it. Is that the purpose? Is the purpose of it to arouse viewers? Does it arouse themselves? What do they get out of it? Is what I've always struggled to understand. Is what does this person get out of doing this? And maybe that makes me less of a human. I'm not autistic. I'm just curious. I'm just curious. I wanted to get someone's input on my confusion. So I just kind of commented on this video, and I basically was like, why are you doing this? I've seen a lot of people do this, and can you help me understand? Like, can you explain what is this behavior for? And someone responded to me with almost equal amounts of confusion. They were, you know, And then someone else responded actually to me with hostility. They basically said, so are you familiar with this thing where people move their bodies with music called dancing? And I'm not stupid. I can obviously understand that this was some kind of dig, right? This was, the words are obviously not, the words themselves are not insulting me, but obviously she's communicating more than just what she's saying, right? She's not just asking, am I familiar with dancing? She's obviously also communicating to me that I'm somewhat of an idiot, you know. Um, but the thing is, all I could say back was, of course, I'm familiar with dancing, but I've never quite understood adult dancing. I don't understand the behavior, what people get out of it, if anything. And so this was one of those cases, right, where someone was asking a honest question, a harmless question, um, completely benevolent, right, in good faith. Yet it was stupid, right? I was asking a stupid question. And what makes a question stupid, right? Is there some kind of common, like, am I supposed to already know and understand it? Because I was asking for input. Maybe I do understand it, but I don't know I understand it. Maybe. But they responded with hostility, sort of passive aggression, sort of a similar frustration that I felt in response to someone asking me what I felt was a ridiculous question. And this basically brought up, thoughts about ego ego and entitlement and boundaries, which I think this has a lot to do with. First of all, I'm going to say, let me say that this is a very, very common thing. What's going on here? What's going on here is a misunderstanding, and it's conflict that is caused by a misunderstanding. And this is so normal. This happens so much in life. And there's no social cohesion here because there's a misunderstanding taking place. And so it's causing conflict instead. Basically, we cannot seem to understand each other. And because we lack an understanding, we cannot seem to coexist. We can't seem to establish it's basically when there's two parties that can't seem to establish terms by which to live by each other. And this causes conflict. And this has a lot to do with ego and entitlements and boundaries. First of all, I'm going to say that ego is not a bad thing. Ego is actually a very, very healthy thing. And so are entitlements. Anybody who understands psychology knows that the ego is actually a normal, healthy thing to have. I understand it's considered a truism to use the term ego to refer to someone who has an oversized ego, and oftentimes, people are very loose with these actual real psychological terms. People often use these types of terms to control people. Basically, if you've learned some kind of buzzword in some capacity, you can weaponize it against somebody. But having some ego is actually very good. The ego is actually a construct that exists to protect the mind. It is a healthy part of a functioning human being. The ego is basically sort of your self-concept, and it exists to protect the mind. Because the mind does need protection, just like the body. The body has its immune system. The ego is the mind's immune system. Everyone has to have some self-concept of who they are, and that means that they have a concept of who they are not. And so that creates boundaries and entitlements, again, which are excellent to have. Now, if your ego is too big, you're going to have a lot of entitlements and a lot of boundaries. And that's going to exacerbate conflict with people. That's going to cause conflict, right? If you're taking up too much space, it's hard for no one to step on your toes. If your toes are huge, everyone is going to step on them on accident. But it is still nonetheless healthy to have an ego and have entitlements and have boundaries. It's just that oftentimes it's very difficult to understand where those are. It's very difficult sometimes to navigate social structures and even just navigate yourself around a particular individual. Sometimes you have to almost feel your way around with like an ant with feelers or like a bug in order to avoid conflict or getting hurt. And sometimes if these things cannot be worked out, there's nothing else really left to do but conflict. Sorry, I have breathing issues sometimes. Tend to get very anxious, but basically this particular individual on this YouTube comment perceived my question as an insult. They perceived it basically as some kind of insult. They perceived it that way, to like I'm insulting them in some capacity, even though I wasn't. And or wasn't intending to, I guess. It's it feels as though, especially nowadays, right? We are living it. I mean, it can be easy. It's very easy to have to get the impression these days that we are living with such a lack of social cohesion and so much social chaos that it's almost impossible to navigate. I say it's easy to get that impression because I think that there's definitely lots of reasons to believe that nowadays. But of course, there are people who will sell you the idea that that wasn't always the case. And I can't say yes or no to that because the only thing we know about those days, back in the days before today, is what they tell us. That's all we really know is what we see. If how history was back in the day, you know. Um, but it just does feel like, you know, that can be very difficult. It can be very difficult sometimes to navigate social structures and navigate individuals in a way that does not cause conflict. You know, I see this a lot in public, right? We see this a lot in public. On, you know, Vine does not, I understand, does not exist anymore as an app, but you know, there's still I understand no one uses World Star hip hop anymore, but we still use YouTube and we still use Instagram, we still use TikTok. Um, you know, there's no shortage, to say the least, of videos that are recorded on someone's phone in the heat of a moment, um, witnessing ridiculous public confrontation. You know, there's no shortage of videos like that where people are just trying to get through their day, and yet there is some extreme hostility taking place, right? Um, Videos of people at a McDonald's, right? Some guy's been waiting for his order, and maybe the cashier uh, said something that came off the wrong way to the customer, and now the customer is throwing everything in the restaurant at the cashier, right? Um, you know, or some person being harassed in the middle of a Target, like a Target checkout line, right? Because they took offense to something that was not intended to cause offense, and they're giving a disproportionate reaction to it. And this can often be most obvious in cases where there is a lack of cultural cohesion. That's one of the strongest examples, is a lack of cultural cohesion. Um, you know, you can make it political. If someone takes offense to somebody else in some capacity, someone has blue hair, they dyed their hair, and some MAGA person is taking offense to it and just throwing a huge fit. Basically, what's happening there is that there is a boundary that someone had that was crossed, and someone else didn't necessarily live by that boundary. Right, this particular individual is basically receiving some kind of law enforcement to a law that they did not live by, some law that they didn't know even. And it can be very difficult for us to, like I said earlier, to know where those boundaries begin and end. And generally, often, in order to avoid conflict entirely, people often don't even want to take any risk because they don't want to offend somebody. And so it creates this sense of isolation between people, where basically the safest way to communicate with someone is not at all. And then they're right, it works. But it's just something that I've been thinking about, which is anger. And frustration. Anger and frustration, I think, is the main theme that is present in all these illustrations that I've painted for you, um, the role that anger plays in all of these scenarios is it enforces these boundaries and these entitlements. And, generally that is the purpose of anger. I mean, I say generally, but I basically understand that that is the primary purpose of anger, which is to um, defend boundaries. It protects us. It enforces boundaries. When a boundary has been crossed, anger is then summoned. That is, I suppose, a natural mechanism. But I've just been thinking a lot lately about anger and anger in our society, and how it seems to be the case that societies run on anger. At least our society seems to be fueled by anger. Like, it runs on anger. And like, anger is the thing that sustains our society. Because anger is the thing that enforces these norms, enforces these customs, enforces these rules. Um, and I was just thinking about how exhausting that is. Because it is. It is very exhausting. You know, um, Basically, people constantly enforcing things via anger and having to constantly mind the law and mind these rules and mind all these people. That can be very exhausting. It's very exhausting for me, and I find it almost kind of dark. It actually feels kind of dark to me. It feels dark to me for the world to run on anger instead of communication or peace or love, maybe, God forbid. Because it just seems I've had, I've kind of had enough of, I've had enough of it. Let me give you another anecdotal story. Some years ago, there was a YouTuber that I came across. It was some new trending YouTuber who was doing things like me, like doing diaries and stuff. It was some kid. It was, it was a boy, it was a male. I'm unclear of his age, but he looked very young, right? He looked like a kid. Um, and basically his content were vlogs, but it was sort of in the vein of incel type of um, culture. He was a young, frustrated male, basically talking about society and talking about um, looks maxing, black pill. It wasn't using exactly those terms, but he was um, he was sort of in that vein of, he struck me as someone who was familiar with these types of terms, Um, and this particular kid came across to me as a very, very vulnerable person. I'm not exactly sure his age, but I assume he was a kid because he looked very young. Excuse me. Um, he was very skinny. He looked very young. He was relatively neotenous. He was very kind of cute-ish, like delicate looking. Like I hesitate to use the word twink. I'm not gonna say that he looked effeminate in any capacity, but he was a small kid generally. So, that makes him somewhat of a vulnerable individual, right? This was not some big guy. And his personality, from what I could see, a lot of his videos were kind of venti. So sometimes it can hard to pick up on a person's personality when they're in an intense emotional state. But he was basically often complaining about his inability to navigate um, society and social structures, and his frustration with that. And he was talking about how much resistance he's faced with his attempts to enter into social structures. He was talking about exactly that, like some type of social norm or custom or rule that was unspoken that he didn't know or understand, yet he received some kind of ridicule or chastising over it. I don't know exactly what it was exactly that he mentioned, but I know that he talked about norms and customs with pertains to gender and sexuality and um, um, groups and normal life, like working. I'm sorry. Sometimes I forget to breathe. And he was quite distressed, is the thing, is that in his videos he was very distressed. He was quite distressed. He was, I quote, was yelling, screaming, "How am I supposed to know that?" In referring to some particular custom that he had violated. And his videos were often him pacing very quickly around his house or his living space. So this was a very, very young and vulnerable individual with high energy and nowhere for that energy to go, and a lot of frustration because of it. And he would often talk about the way that people don't treat him right, and the way that people he thinks that he would often talk about standards and social standards. So I've done a lot of telling of this story. So let me just get to it. I noticed in the comment section of his videos that instead of receiving love and support, and understanding and people listening to him, he actually received ridicule and really disrespect. The top comment on one of his videos I noticed was actually someone, getting a dig at him, basically saying, he pretty much just said, I'm only 3 seconds into this. I'm only 30 seconds into this video, and I already know exactly what the problem is. And he didn't say anything else. Now, it's not exactly even clear to me what the problem is, because he didn't clarify what the problem is. But if he was actually intending, obviously, to assist him and help him, he wouldn't, leave it open-ended like that, right? So it's clear that it was basically a joke, right? If he was actually intending on helping, he would clarify. But it was basically formatted along the lines of sort of a sarcastic or passive-aggressive joke. And a lot of the comments were quite similar to that. Now, this actually kind of upset me because I actually liked this kid. To me, he seemed very honest and vulnerable, and I liked that. Now, I had joined this kid's Discord, and I had attempted to communicate with him, but I had trouble communicating with him, which is fine, that happens. But it just seemed very unfair to me that this happened, because here you have someone who is facing a lot of is having great difficulty just entering any kind of social structure, and instead of receiving support and assistance doing so, he's receiving he's basically a joke. That was basically the whole point, is that he was the joke. That was his reward for his vulnerability, was he's now a joke. Why did I bring this up? Why did I bring this up? Why did I tell this story? I just think it's very, very interesting because here is an individual who is struggling with the same thing that I struggle with. And the thing is that we all struggle with this all the time. This is actually quite a common thing in society, is for people to misunderstand each other and for it to cause conflict. This particular individual is just facing an extreme amount of it because they can't seem to even enter into social structure. So how are they supposed to pick up on the norms of that social structure? If you're trying to enter some kind of secret club, some kind of club, how are you supposed to know how the club works if you're not in the club? But the thing with society is that it seems as though the only way to enter society is to know how to enter. Like it's sort of a paradox, which is basically where there's like this rule in society that you kind of have to figure it out for yourself in order to receive acceptance. Is basically that sort of the test. If you want to receive acknowledgement from people, if you want to be seen and heard, if you want to see and hear other people and you want to be seen and heard, then you have to pass a test that they don't tell you, it seems. Now, I assume that a lot of these comments were like the joke was basically his appearance, right? That's why I mentioned his appearance so much, and I went into great detail about his appearance. I think it had something to do with his appearance because he would often talk about his inadequacy sexually with women. Um, and it seemed as though that was sort of the running joke, um, is that he's inadequate and he's inferior. And here you have someone who is struggling to accept that role, right? No one wants to accept that. No one wants to accept some kind of role where they are considered inadequate and inferior. Yet here you have an entire um, group of people enforcing that role upon them through public humiliation and ridicule. And they seem to act as though that is how it's supposed to work. And no one particularly clarified it for him. The top comment was passive aggressive joke, which sort of explains, goes back into what I was saying about how there seems to be a lot of rules that we don't necessarily know what they are. And there's a lot of boundaries and entitlements that we don't know exactly where they are. And it's very difficult to navigate these things. And it can cause a lot of frustration. And when frustration builds up, it leads to a lot of anger and a lot of aggression, a lot of hostility and defensiveness. But it just seems to be such an intense phenomenon is the what's the word? The prevalence of anger. I don't think the word porous is applicable here. But it seems as though anger has sort of one second, let me just Google the word I'm looking for. It seems as though there seems to be a huge prevalence of anger in society and among people. Pervasive. The pervasiveness of anger. Because it seems to be an essential thing to a functioning social structure is anger. That the social structure cannot exist without anger, it seems to be the case. And I find that deeply exhausting. And I'm surprised others don't find it exhausting too. Because this is something that bothers me. It just feels very, it feels very dark. It feels very cold. Like, we're not allowed to talk about these things, and we're not allowed to analyze these things without facing this wall of severe hostility and defensiveness. And for as long as there is this wall of anger protecting this giant unnamed thing, we might not move forward from a lot of social ills. I'm not sure, communication is essential to getting along, I guess, or peace or social cohesion. I just find it very exhausting. It's tiring for me. Why did I tell this story? Why did I talk about this? What am I getting at? Where else am I going with this? Because this video is already very long. I'm gonna give you another story. Okay, another short story. Though I know I tend to take a long time to tell one little story. So back at my dad's property, um, some years ago, um, when I was struggling a lot, like I'm struggling a lot right now, but back when I was unmedicated for my PTSD, um, and I was dealing with a lot of distress and confusion. Um, I I had a cat that my sister left in my care. Um, and I was outside in my dad's property, and there was a wire fence around the property, and in the corner of the property there was there's a bunch of tumbleweeds pushed into that corner, and the wire fence was lowered. Wire fences, they have like these poles every so and so feet to maintain the wire fence to hold it up. And the wire fence in this corner was like halfway down, right? And I was surprised no one had noticed it before, and then it had been there for so long. And I guess it wasn't really an issue because it was hard to access because there was tons of tumbleweeds pushed into the corner of that property. I'm sorry, of the property. Well, yeah, pushed into the corner of the property, so it was difficult to access the fence. But it still made me somewhat uncomfortable because I have a cat now, and our neighbor has dogs. And now I don't think I was in the wrong here. Um, it was it's somewhat normal for, a female to go to patriarch and lodge a complaint. Let's, um, I mean, um, I wasn't necessarily going to bitch to my dad. I went to tell him about it. I wasn't necessarily just going to go and bitch and bitch and bitch. But I didn't want to bring it to his attention because that is somewhat normal. It's somewhat normal for anybody, whether they're a female or not. But I feel like it's especially normal for, um, a female to notice things that a male might not, and then bring them to the attention of the strongest nearby male. who then handles it. I mean, he's the one in charge. He's the owner of the property. And like I said, I didn't go to him to just bitch about it, right? But I did want to bring it to his attention. Um, and so when I brought it to his attention, he said, so let's go out and take a look. Show me what you're talking about. And when he saw it, he was so quick to give an explanation that I thought was so foolish. He had just kind of made up his mind, like right on the spot as soon as he took a look at it as to how it occurred. And I'm not necessarily a genius. Well, maybe I am. Shit, I don't want to put myself down, but he was so fast to jump to a explanation. He basically pushed on it, so it was halfway down and it was basically like folded over on itself. And the first thing out of his mouth was that the neighbor's dogs had been jumping on it. And I really feel like that is quite the stretch to say that the reason it's halfway down is because the neighbor's dogs have been jumping on it. I mean, a fence is like this thin as my fingers, thinner. It's wire fence. It's chain link fence, right? So, if the dog is hanging over it, I can see that. Um, obviously a dog can't stand on a thin wire like a tightrope. So if a dog is hanging over the top of it, I guess I can see that. But I lived there for a decade and I had never seen the neighbor's dogs, hanging on the fence. So how is it supposed to get folded over? From the dogs jumping on it. If it's folded over, I can see, yeah, jumping on it now, like what is it? What are they jumping on it like a trampoline? If it's folded over, I can see now it's probably easier to push it down, right? Because you have more surface area to apply a force to, so you can amplify your force. But it just seemed like a stretch. Like, that is my personal opinion, though. Okay, he could have been right. Maybe the dogs were hanging over the fence for years and I had never noticed. Okay, he could have been right. But it seemed to be the case to me that it was just caused by structural decay. Corrosion, erosion, the bolts that sort of hold the chain link to the actual posts, could have become loose, right? And it just slowly withers down and down and down. That seemed to be the strongest and most likely scenario to me. And I was just kind of shocked that he immediately had to accuse somebody of it. Right? And, my family was abusive as fuck to me. I mean, dealt with a lot of narcissistic abuse. So simply interacting with my dad was often quite difficult. And having any kind of neutral interaction with my dad was cherished to me. I could almost embellish neutral interactions with my dad, almost as pretending that I had a relationship with him more than I actually did. Because they were so rare and valuable. And my dad was a very angry man, a very conservative man, a very insecure man. So it makes total sense to me that his immediate reaction was to accuse somebody of doing this to the fence and saying that the neighbor's dogs are now jumping on it. Almost as if he feels as though that someone always has to be responsible when there's something bad going on. But I did not reveal all of this. I did not reveal all of these thoughts to him at the time. I mean, I was quite scared to even think these thoughts. This was years ago. But in my attempts to create that sort of rapport, yes, that is the word. I wanted to use that word earlier in this video, and I couldn't summon it. In order to just establish some kind of rapport with him, which is extremely essential to avoid this type of conflict caused by misunderstanding. I wanted to have this sort of honest communication. And I was just really shocked by his explanation. And so I simply responded with another question. A benevolent, harmless question. Like I said, I was not disrespectful. I didn't even reveal all of this to him. But I was simply shocked by his explanation, so it did not seem to be the obvious explanation to me. It was not obvious to me. So I just kind of asked him, really? You think it's the dogs jumping on it? Is all I really asked. I was like, oh, you think it's the dogs? That's all I asked him. Oh, you think it's the dogs jumping on it? And he responded. He seemed to respond with a very constrained amount of anger. I could sense. He didn't yell at me. He didn't get mad at me, but it almost felt as though he wanted to, and that he was shocked that I even questioned him. But the thing is that if two people want to work on a problem together, they have to communicate, right? If we're trying to work on a problem and we're trying to resolve this problem, it makes total sense that two people should be able to talk to each other and say, that's what you think it is? You think it's the dogs jumping on it? But he responded with this sort of constrained amount of anger. He didn't start yelling, though I expected him to. And I could feel it coming on. I could sense his anger. But it was quite constrained. Because so much in the past, if I had asked something like this, he would have responded with great anger. Just that I had questioned him. But I was basically trying to put myself out there anyway to create that rapport. And I could sense the anger welling up in him. Yet he also sort of realized that he was unable to lash out in that anger because of my tone of voice. I actually, growing up, not growing up, growing up, I was unable to ask questions or simply communicate like a normal person. So, in the past 5 years, I've been basically trying to focus on things like tone of voice. when I developed PTSD really bad, I had to learn to actually master things like tone of voice, simply to clarify and emphasize my neutrality in the face of someone who is extremely hostile and physically abusive and scary. And so, because of my tone of voice, I had successfully communicated that I was it was a neutral question. Whereas otherwise, he perceived it as a non neutral question, as an insulting question. And because I sensed that anger in him, that communicates to me that, I don't know, I guess we're not allowed to resolve this together. Don't even fucking bother trying to just accept his explanation. He doesn't, he often did not need help. He was one of those people who refused help. And if you tried to help him, he basically would take it as an insult. And I find a lot of men, especially MAGA men and dads, are this way, whereas they take being helped as an insult and making them like you're insulting them when you offer to help them. And he was definitely one of those people. But I think it's a great example of this strain of anger and boundaries and difficulty navigating those boundaries. It can be difficult enough simply to navigate society and the rules by which society operates. But it can be even more difficult simply navigating your first gatekeeper, right? Your parents, your family. Individuals can be difficult to navigate. Knowing what offends them, what doesn't. And, obviously, oftentimes it's very understandable what offends people, right? Like I said, it's the ego is a healthy thing to have, but your ego can be oversized, right? If people cannot live around you, and they're just constantly stepping on your toes on accident, I'm not going to say that it's you. But that shows that there is a disharmony between you and your environment, and there's no social cohesion. Um, there's a great misunderstanding going on. But I find it very, very exhausting. I find people's anger to be extremely exhausting because it feels as though I'm being hit with it constantly. Like I'm constantly having to brace for impact, it seems. It seems as though I'm constantly anticipating anger and almost preemptively shutting myself down before it even happens, just to get along. It seems to be how societies are run, is anger. And I guess that might make sense, seeing as how basically every society, when you go far back enough, is traced back to, the primordial form of like all human society is violent, as far as I'm aware. I mean, every race of people on this earth, as far as I'm aware, uh, I'm generally pretty sure inherited their land from another group of people. Of course, that's not always the case. There are truly indigenous people. Um, but every culture, even our own, seems to have, a history of violence and, origins there. So it would make sense that our society runs on violence. But why would a society run on non-violence, right? Why would a society even run on non-violence when there's violent societies? How would that non-violent society even survive? But it just seems as though it feels as though I'm alone, because I just find all this anger to be exhausting. Now, of course, maybe this is coming from someone who's extremely disprivileged, right? I do not have the privilege to understand um, social norms and customs because I'm such an outsider. I do not have the privilege to understand um, adult dancing because my body image is so poor. Maybe if my body image was much better, I would want to share my body with the whole world. Maybe. But that's basically what this video was about, is that I'm just kind of connecting all these like strains of anger and frustration and communication and misunderstanding and conflict. How do I feel about it? I'm curious to know how other people feel about it, because I'm sure that if I was the Queen of Sheba, I would probably not be singing the same tune, right? I would not be questioning anger as an enforcement tool, right? As a way to enforce social customs, right? If I was the Queen of Sheba, I probably would want to have my status protected and not have it explained, right? Maybe that's what it is, right? Maybe that's what it is, because if you can explain um, social hierarchy, then it can be argued with and maybe overcome. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Maybe that's what it is. if you can explain, if you can explain the justification for authority or the justification of power, then you kind of disempowered it, didn't you? Right? Because if power is if power and authority is justified by reason or logic or rationality or something, if it has to be justified at all, then now you sort of created a opening, I feel, right? Whereas if the rules by which you are expected to abide are very clear and written for you and explained, then maybe you might be able to draw stronger patterns and parallels and be able to understand the source of the rule giver. And that might give you too much power, perhaps. If the rules are obscure, then maybe that keeps people in some degree of fear and submission. And they generally learn that you abide by these rules because they're the rules, not because they make sense, right? You obey God because he's God, right? You obey your dad because he's your dad. You obey society because it's society and it's the way we do things. And you don't question them. Maybe that's why. Maybe social customs and norms are intentionally obscure. They are intentionally obscure, maybe to disenfranchise that kid. Maybe. Maybe that's the best way to maintain power. That's interesting. That's interesting. I just know that it's become extremely exhausting for me to navigate um, this minefield of social norms and customs because it feels as though it is like that. It is a minefield. Um, and the risk has become not worth the payoff. You know, I can't even go anywhere without someone harassing me or bothering me. I can't seem to even communicate with someone without knowing exactly what I'm going to get. Seems as though it's just a mixed bag of hostility and indifference. I think I did a good job here. I think I did an okay job here explaining, or at least communicating what I've been trying to communicate today. So, thank you for listening to my very, very long vlog slash diary. Um, this is just something that I was thinking about today. Um, maybe it's of some use to you. And I apologize for my videos and my diaries to be so long, but I don't do this for you. I do this for me. I think. Anyway.